Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk.
And I'm Brad Hairston.
We're here with a special episode of Transform Now to complete our 2023 season.
Michael, we're finally at the end of the year.
I can't believe that we've made it through this year, but I'm so glad. We had a lot of great content this year.
We certainly did. I've been reflecting back on the various podcast conversations we had. We published 50 in all, which is amazing. We covered some incredible topics and had some amazing guests as usual. This is our last episode of 2023. And what we thought we'd do is highlight some of those great moments that we had on the podcast this year. So Michael and I have both taken on the task of reviewing and thinking about our discussions. And we both narrowed down all the great things that we talked about down to 5 highlights that we
Which was very difficult to do, by the way.
It was really difficult, extremely difficult, but somehow we got there, and we're going to share those with you now.
One thing that I noticed that this year, I ended up spending a whole lot of time talking with a whole lot of futurists. I didn't realize that was such a big deal and how many people were actually futurists, but each of them had a slightly different viewpoint on how things are going to look as we move through this next technological and cultural change as we go forward. So interesting stuff from them, bunch of authors, lots of folks talking about workforce transformation and AI, which I know you've had quite a few conversations about AI as well.
Yes, AI was a prevalent theme, especially Gen AI, but we also went into some other areas related to it. I also talked to a number of our TAP partners, talked to a few advisory partners, and the other thing I got to do this year, which was a lot of fun, is talk to some customers. I ended up doing 5 customer podcasts, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's always good to hear their perspective. And I think that trend will continue on into next year, which is also exciting.
I agree. Before we get started, the show notes will highlight each of the folks that we're talking about today, including the episode numbers. In case you happen to have missed that entire episode, you can listen in to hear what they said in its entirety.
Okay, without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start by talking about episode 215, in which I talked to a very interesting gentleman named Alex Ratner. He's the CEO of an AI company called Snorkel. And Alex is a Stanford grad, extremely smart guy. He talked about the incredibly important role of data in AI development.
Most AI these days is machine learning, which means AI that learns from data. Traditionally, data science has been taught as what we call model-centric. So it's all about building the models, the algorithms, tweaking and tuning the parameters. And the data is something you get from someone else. What if a lot of the ML stack gets automated, becomes more standardized, and what happened then? Where would the next bottlenecks be? And what we saw happening and thought would happen is that ML gets automated. It also becomes more data hungry. That's the natural trade-off. You get more automation, no free energy. It requires more data to learn from, to do all that stuff now automatically. The quality of the data and how it's labeled and curated is one of the most important things. It's having data that is curated and labeled for the machine learning problem you're trying to solve. And doing that can be incredibly slow.
I knew data was key to AI, but what this discussion really emphasized to me is that it's also the primary bottleneck in AI development, AI deployment. And Alex made that really clear. And he gave examples of companies, customers that he's worked with that have these amazing algorithms, these amazing models, but they can't get them rolled out because labeling and curating the massive amounts of data that has to be fed into these models to train them is really the critical path, and it's what blows down the whole process.
It's painstaking, isn't it, to do that manually?
Yeah. And so anyway, he went on to talk about how his company has developed an automated way to label data to speed this up significantly, akin to software development, to make data development more programmatic. And it was very impressive. I had no idea that AI could play a role on the data side the same way that it's doing on the algorithmic side, if you will.
That's very interesting. And kind of along those lines, I had done a podcast with a lawyer about data and how critical it is to get the right data if you're using AI algorithms that aren't your own, if we're going to ChatGPT. So whether you're using your own data and need to label it yourself, or you're using someone else's data, which now introduces different kinds of risk in terms of the ownership of that data and copyright holding, et cetera. There's a lot you have to take into account when it comes to the data you're feeding into AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's go to your first highlight of the
Yeah, so mine's kind of like a twofer. So we'll start with Trond Undheim, who's a futurist. He's a really sharp guy also who had written several books. And one of his quotes I thought was very interesting as we look towards the capabilities of AI as we go into the future.
But I do think our kids, so let's just put it 10, 15 years into the future, the workplace is going to be totally transformed. If you are an expert in one thing, you're going to be working for a robot. If you're an expert in 2 to 3 to 4 domains and can communicate cleverly across those and are an enormously good communicator, a steward of automation, but also, I think most importantly, you understand the interface, the proper interface between you and a whole plethora of automatic systems that all have AI embedded in them, a mix of software and hardware. That's really where the skill is at. If you, in addition, can be an engineer of those systems, can be part of shaping those systems, at least shaping the user interfaces of those systems, then you're one of the shepherds of the new world.
Well, that's a very interesting quote. And part of it can be a little bit startling or scary. But I guess the big takeaway there is we need to expand our skills. We need to continually retrain and become more versatile ourselves. It's not just about technology becoming more versatile. We better do things on our part to improve our capabilities.
Absolutely.
Or else be working for a robot.
Absolutely. He brought up some really interesting things throughout the rest of that podcast. And part of that was going into this change that's happening. It's happening at such a rapid pace that it's difficult for us to understand. Standing still, learning one thing and becoming an expert in it really doesn't make you an expert anymore, because AI will leverage your expertise, but will basically be having you work for it, which I thought was very interesting. And quite honestly, I have another podcast that kind of talked about that in even more depth from the perspective of how our workforces are an ecosystem. So this is from episode 231, speaking to Elizabeth Altman and Christoph Riddell, who are really going through this concept of what a workforce ecosystem is and broadening that out. Very fascinating conversation, but along the lines of what Trond mentioned, Christoph brought up this really interesting perspective.
What we think is going to happen with the increasing use of AI is that not just will the tasks that humans do change, but how we assign these tasks in the first place. And so if you think about, does this mean we're going to have AI bosses? On some level, a lot of jobs already do exactly that. If you are a driver for Uber, for example, then AI will tell you exactly what your next task is. It will say, go to this street corner and pick up this person because they want to go to the airport. And then it actually micromanages the specific steps that you need to do to complete that task. Namely, it will give you GPS directions to drive to the airport. And not only that, it does actually set the wage that you receive for that task. Right? There's a search price algorithm that uses sophisticated AI to predict the current supply of drivers and the demand of riders. And based on those, predicts how much this task that you're completing right now is worth. And so it's not too far-fetched to think of AI bosses.
It seems like some of us are already working for AI as we start looking at how things are working. And maybe that's not a bad thing, because if you ask those Uber drivers, they're very happy with the way that their operations are working in terms of when they can start work, when they can end work, and they can choose to do what they want to do within that kind of ecosystem that they're playing in.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think anyone that's in the gig economy, there's so many examples, but anyone that's fulfilling work that is being organized and assigned and largely orchestrated by AI could say that.
That's true.
So,
And you have to make sure that you're doing this in a fair way. And that's, I think, something you talked about with your next guest, Igor.
yeah, episode 242, really interesting gentleman named Igor Grubasic. He works with VMware, and he had written an article that tackled the topic of bias, which is very topical right now with AI being such a focus. Lots of people talking about fairness and equality and bias. And let's hear what he has to say on this topic.
When we hear the word bias, we usually think about something negative. That's one of the most prevalent understanding of bias. But the dictionary definition of bias is your subjective opinion about something that may or may not be wrong. So if you look at everyday decision making and the big decisions that we make in our life, those are all bias influenced decisions. And as I saw in one of TED presentations, speeches, the author said bias is essentially a survival skill. Is if you're going down the street and you see a large dog without the owner going towards you, you're going to cross the street. It's kind of a survival technique.
Mm-hmm.
As much as it can be good, it can be bad as well. It's your subjectiveness that's making you an expert. And your subjectiveness is basically your biased view of the world and the causality within that world.
Interesting point of view. You hear bias, it's always negative, right? People talk about how we need to get rid of it, get rid of it. Igor was pretty insistent that there are lots of good forms of bias and that we need to preserve those. In fact, that's what really distinguishes experts. It's their biased point of view on their field of expertise. And he went on to advocate for a balanced approach where AI is not making the decisions on behalf of humans, but it's used as a tool to aid humans. We need to verify AI generated outputs to make sure they're reliable and put the guardrails around them where necessary.
Kind of reminds me of the Terminator scenario. If you have one specific metric that you're basing your decisions on, it's pretty obvious that humans are the problem and therefore should be eliminated, versus the bias is really around how can humans benefit the most from their environment to allow that bias to creep into the decisions that are being made through the data that's being presented. Bias it in favor of people and in humanity and our growth versus against a specific metric saying that things are bad or the environment needs to be changed. So therefore we'll just wipe out people.
Very true.
Yeah. I had a good conversation with John Peebles, episode 244, talking about the rapid pace of change. And we've talked about this before on a number of different podcasts, this concept that the change is happening and you need to be prepared for it. And his idea is that people need to be flexible in terms of how they are learning about change, preparing for that change, but also from the perspective of the way we look at our infrastructures and our technologies and the concepts of being very flexible in your mind. And so I think this little clip here will kind of demonstrate that.
And I think that is an opportunity, but only if you've got that bedrock infrastructure in place that lets you experiment, mix and match quickly. And it's actually it haunts me to think of the cost of not having that stuff in place, because you could make a big bet on a clear front runner and a clear winner and an obvious solution today that literally in 6 to 9 months, you're getting laughed out of the room for having done that. And that's a scary position to be in.
We've seen this whole change in 6 to 9 months. Last November 2022 is when we had sort of the breakout for ChatGPT. And within that 6 to 9 months, there was so much change that's happened. And even the 6 to 9 months, then after that, now we're looking at, again, similar changes in terms of the amount of progress that were being made. So it's very difficult to just pick a front runner and run with it when in fact there's so much other things that are going on with, even within the large language model themselves, having differences between Google's large language model or Microsoft's ChatGPT, or going on with the AWS version. There's each one of them is leapfrogging each other as we go.
Yeah, I think this time last year, we were talking about one large language model, which was not the only one, but it was the most prominent. And it's the only one that people were talking about, ChatGPT. Now, end of 2023, there's literally thousands of them that are on the market that are available, some that are very domain specific. And it's interesting, Michael, I've been part of the group talking to a lot of our customers about Gen AI, and we're consistently finding that they want to consume not just one, but multiple large language models in the same process automation.
Absolutely. And to that point, you had another conversation with someone that was our most listened to podcast of the year, Ted Shelton. Talk us about that particular episode, because that one gained a lot of traction and really set the groundwork for a lot of stuff we've been talking about.
Definitely. Yeah. Episode 228 featured Ted, who's been on our podcast before. He's an expert partner with Bain and very, very knowledgeable on Gen AI, does a lot of speaking and writing and works with customers in this space. And he said some really compelling things about the impact, the broader impact of Gen AI on organizations.
We as companies need to think about how people are good at critical thinking, creativity, and interpersonal relationships. And those are three things the machines are not good at least yet. So we still want people doing those three things. And we need to be thinking about how everything else is done by a machine. And so I think that what it leads to strategically, though, is a complete realignment of the way we organize business. Why do we organize companies the way we do today? Marketing, sales, finance. We have the opportunity to rethink how they are organized. And I expect the organization of the future enterprise is going to be much more around how processes run within those organizations. So I'm going to have an end-to-end process that my company engages in. And I'm going to have a leader of that process, and I'm going to have the people and the computation that supports that process all reporting into that process leader, as opposed to a functional leader.
So this whole idea of Gen AI being the impetus to get companies to think about how they organize, to think about where they want to assign their leaders and rethink the way they operate. He's one of the only people I interviewed on Gen AI that got into this. He's always on the leading edge, thinking about not just what the technology is now enabling and the use cases and how they're expanding, but how it's really changing the way that companies think about work, think about how they organize around work.
I agree. And I would say that whole concept of how you think about work is changing, and how people think about interactions with machines and how machines are interacting now with humans, which is a discussion I had with Rob Whiteman in episode 239. Really get into some interesting stuff. He wrote a book. It's called Artificially Human. And the idea behind it, we are now interacting with our digital workers, our AI companions here, in a way that is changing the way that we see our coworkers. Listen to this.
The average vocabulary that people use is getting smaller and more efficient. And even you look at the number of people that are learning coding languages. So I actually think it's really interesting to see the trends in the ways in which people are becoming more like machines. At the same time, machines are becoming more like people. And that trend, I would expect, is going to accelerate even more as we start to enter the age of augmented reality and virtual reality. The hardware is not nearly where it needs to be for that to be adopted at large right now. But I do think that idea of having a more seamless human in the loop design of how work gets done and even just how society functions, I think you're going to continue to see more and more of that convergence in the next several years.
So as you see, machines are becoming like people, and people are starting to interact with them that way. because we're actually starting to interact a little bit more like a machine as we understand how these interactions work. So it's interesting to see how this coming together of coworkers as we get better and better AI and more adept at leveraging it within our organizations.
Yeah. And I maybe wouldn't have thought of this as much as I do now, a year after Gen AI hit the scene, but I'm starting to use it more and more in my daily activities. And I'm not even using a paid version. I'm using a freebie Gen AI application, but just the way that it can help me assimilate information, summarize, think creatively about ways to present it or bake it into maybe something I'm writing. It's never going to replace what we do, but the augmentation aspect of it is really powerful, which Rob, of course, was talking about.
And this is a skill that has to be learned or acquired. And someone who talked about that was one of your folks you interviewed on another podcast. Can you go into that?
Yeah. Episode 245 with one of my favorite TAP partners for Blue Prism, and that's Fathom AI. They're just such an interesting company. We've had them on the podcast before, but they're essentially a company that helps their customers understand the impact of emerging technology on their workforce so they can be strategic about how they do their workforce planning. And so I interviewed John Rogers, who is their VP of Global Strategic Accounts in London. And here's something interesting he had to say about understanding the difference between task and skills.
There's a lot of discussion currently. It's skills and skills-based economy. It seems to be the new flavor. We had strategic workforce planning, and before that, 360 review of the customer. I mean, you see these waves come and go. Right now, it's around skills-based economies and so forth. But I think it's important when you're talking about automation to focus on tasks as well. What enterprises are looking for is the completion of a task, not the acquisition of a skill. It's tasks that drive the economy and the completion of those tasks. Skills are how we accomplish those tasks. So it's important when you're evaluating impacts to go down to that task level.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I mean, I'm guilty of probably overemphasizing skills or thinking about skills because in our world, skills are what we've been adding to the digital workers through AI for some time and now Gen AI being part of the mix. But his point is good in that to rethink work and to reinvent work, you really do need to get down to the lowest level, get down to those tasks. And John and his company Fathom, they do that in such an impactful way, not only to understand who's going to be impacted, but they have the ability to help think about where people can use their skills to be assigned to other types of tasks that maybe are in a different functional area, but they're things that these people could do with some reskilling and some training, which I think is another really cool thing they do because they're helping companies reskill their labor instead of laying people off because their job's been automated.
And I think you brought that up. His goal was talking about the objectives that the businesses have at the end of the day, include tasks to at the end, create those objectives or fulfill those objectives. And when you change the mix of the resources to add digital workers, naturally your skills are going to have to change within that new mix to allow those tasks to be accomplished in the most effective way, which is not a bad thing. It helps people grow into more strategic roles and gets them in a different role that allows them to be more productive, but also probably a lot happier.
Yeah. And another thing about Fathom, because of the work they do, they gather an incredible amount of data from their customers, from governments, from different economies around the world. They just have a massive set of data. And so I asked John, what's the learning that you've picked up from this data at your disposal? And here's what he had to say.
Technical skills are important for many jobs. They'll continue to be. But what's interesting and surface is that people really need to retrain frequently to ensure they keep up with the pace of technology. But that importance of non-technical skills like communication and critical thinking and so forth, the ability to learn cultural and social intelligence are all becoming significantly more important in order to have longevity in a career and be able to transfer within a career.
I would sum this up as humans still have a chance. We're going to survive. We're not going to be eliminated. We don't have to get in the bunker and start worrying about Skynet. And I think, again, they're talking to companies around the world that are all dealing with a rapidly changing work environment with AI basically getting into every aspect of the work that we do. And so for them to come away with this overarching assessment that most companies still realize the value of human skills, innately human skills, I totally agree with that.
As people are changing and understanding from a social dynamics concept, computers are really good at what they do, but they don't understand necessarily how geopolitical issues affect things, how economic things affect people, how they affect the way they approach their jobs, how they affect the market in general from a selling perspective. So there are certain things that leveraging AI makes perfect sense. In fact, it's very useful to have that kind of in place, but humans driving it, the why behind it, I think is really the reasoning why you want to have a mix of humans and digital workers approaching your business to allow that to happen, and keeping people up to date on how to manage those social interaction skills is critical.
Well, let's go to your fifth and final highlight.
So Chris Stegner, fascinating guy, really well-spoken. He's the CEO of very big things, and he helps work with companies to build out strategic plans for their transformations in interesting ways, from a product design and that sort of thing. So he's got a bunch of very creative people that work for him. And I asked him a question about, as economic indicators change and we have downturns in the market or recessions, or we have upturns and we're looking to grow quickly, things change back and forth. And that pace of innovation from a technical standpoint is always racing ahead, but oftentimes organizations kind of tap the brakes when it comes to implementing this. So I asked him, when's it a good time for companies to maybe back off on things? And he had a very interesting perspective on that.
To me, the idea of turning on or off innovation is just a silly one. I think innovation always needs to be part of what everybody's doing. What that means can take on a couple of different forms. And funny enough, you make me think of something I shared with our team here not too long ago, which was, I'm down in Fort Lauderdale and I had to drive into Miami one day, and I was running late. I was like 15 minutes late. And I pulled up Google Maps to tell me, like, okay, how long is it going to take me, et cetera. And Google Maps popped up and it said, you're going to be 15 minutes late. And I was like, I wonder if I can make it up. And I looked and it was like pure green the whole way. Like traffic was perfect the whole way. And I was like, Google knows me pretty well, and if traffic's perfect, like, I'm going to get there 15 minutes late. But made me think of other times when, if I pulled up Google Maps and it said, you're going to be 15 minutes late, but it was like bright red and orange and so forth, and traffic was messed up all over the place, I would say to myself, I could probably make up those 15 minutes. Like, I might have to switch lanes at the right times. I might have to move a little this, that, et cetera, but I can work with this. Like, there's stuff like obstacles that I can get around that'll get me there on time. And I came back with that same analogy in mind, which is like, when markets are down and the world's a little crazy and people are a little scared, to me, that's Google Maps with the red and the orange. And you have two choices in that situation. You can say, I'm just going to sit in traffic, which to me would be hunkering down until the storm passes. Hey, let's just be really lean right now. Or you could be innovative and start saying, what opportunities are there to get around this? And I can actually like get further ahead than I could have otherwise if I look for the opportunities and I am innovative, like I'm thinking in that way.
So I thought that was interesting using the Google Maps analogy, because when the roads are open, when we have a good market, traffic is flowing, the business is flowing, there's ample opportunity for all the players in the market to be able to get ahead because there's such growth in the areas they're looking to go to. But when companies start running into traffic, when they start getting issues with, hey, we can't just do things the way we used to, and perhaps we should pull back because the economic situation is getting to be a little scary, perhaps we should think about it differently. He was saying something quite different, which is that's your opportunity. During those hard times, that's the opportunity to leverage the most important resource you have. That's your people, to start thinking strategically about what could you do in these constrained times to make it ahead, to be able to continue to build and continue to innovate in a way that other companies who may be more frightened would pull back on. So in good times, it's easy for everyone to get ahead. It's the challenging times where you really have to take your best resources, your people who know the business, and apply them in a way that maybe is thinking outside the box, taking those back roads that maybe Google Maps doesn't show you right away.
This is such a timely thing to talk about because just yesterday, Google said it would take us 45 minutes to get to a location when it actually took us 30 minutes longer because traffic always gets crazy around rush hour time in Dallas. And for whatever reason, Google didn't factor all that in. So yeah, sometimes these apps are not as smart as we think they are, although most of the time they do pretty well.
That's true. But I think the analogy still applies, though, from an economic perspective. It's time to innovate when other people are sitting in traffic. It's time for you to innovate, to figure out if there's some back roads or some other plans you should make to get ahead. And I know some of our customers that you spoke to have been doing just that, and they have been doing fantastically.
When I talk to our customers, I always like to hear about their success stories and also just ask them, what has enabled your automation program to really scale and grow and just continue to extend the value of automation across the company? And I'm going to share 2 excerpts from customers that I think speak to this really well. The first one from episode 230 is Namita Pandey, who was running Pfizer's automation program. She's now moved into a different role. She's the head of digital innovation and strategy for R&D. But let's listen to what she had to say.
We started a campaign called Automation Domination. We were able to create a lot of videos, small, short videos, few-minute videos. We were able to go do road shows at various locations and give demos, run different boot camps and various other things just so that we could educate folks what automation is, what are the benefits of automation and why they should leverage it. We also did a lot of marketing within our intranet sites, that is by using messages in Yammer, Teams, Go Live messages, talking about what automation went live, use cases. And all of these things really helped because people understood what we are doing, how we can help them.
So first of all, I love the fact that they called their campaign Automation Domination. That's a great name.
I agree.
That says a lot right there. I think to me, what she shared was really amazing to hear the depth of ways that they went to the business and the variety of ways in which they educated them. And it wasn't just, here's a video, take a watch when you want. I mean, they did road shows, they did demos, they did boot camps, they used their internal message boards. I mean, they just did so much to make sure that everyone understood what automation was, what automation is not. And I don't think anyone at Pfizer could avoid really knowing the role that it was playing and the great results that were coming from it. So I think it certainly has been huge for their program to go at it this way.
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that they're really embedding that into their culture, that the culture should not be simply, let's continue doing what we can and maybe automate here and there and see what we can do with it. This is really a much, much better viewpoint of saying, listen, we're going to put this in as our culture, as our go-to. And certainly there's going to be people involved in all kinds of areas, but let's see how efficient and effective we can be by leveraging automation. And if you don't know what's going on in the rest of the company, let's tell you.
Yeah, exactly. And the second customer podcast that I want to highlight here, same question. What has allowed you to have the success that you have? I asked this to Susie Dack in episode 238. She runs the automation program at Banner Health. And let's hear what she had to say.
We've really expanded not only our capabilities within the intelligent automation space, but also our staff as well. We've expanded by bringing in folks that are already part of the Banner system that have worked in the Banner system for many, many years. They've migrated into my department because they're so interested in the technology. But we've really tried to bring in a skill set that is in an area that we want to expand in. So I have a couple of revenue cycle folks that are business analysts in that space. I have one that is from the insurance division space, so she knows their operations quite well. Another one that has a business background. So if we want to venture into anything in the finance space, or also she has a revenue cycle background, so we can really utilize her skill set. So we've brought folks in that actually have that type of background that can solve the problem quickly because they know who to go to get things done.
So I've heard this one before from other customers, but Susie, I think, emphasized it probably the most. And I really think it's a great idea. And that is build your automation team from within by recruiting people out of the various business functions and other business units where you want to do automation. Bring the people in that have the relationships, they have the expertise of the processes there. It just makes so much sense. And I think by not having this type of skill set in your automation team, it just makes it harder to go and to win over the business and really evangelize automation. I think a lot of our customers probably could benefit from the same thing.
Yeah, what a great approach to, because this kind of sums up almost everything we've just been talking about, which is change is happening. You may need to be reskilled because of the changes in how that work output's being done. You have the expertise. You've been working in the business and you know what's going on. This is a transition in the way that the companies are working, the way that people are working within those companies to allow them to bring their most effective resources to bear. Whether that's a digital worker working in one area or a human working in another, the reality is that by transitioning these skills from the traditional roles that the business folks have maybe have been in for a long time, they can transition into these newer roles that allow them to springboard their own careers, but also springboard the business to the next level.
Michael, it's been a fantastic year of podcasting. Again, thank you for taking time with me to recap some of our favorite moments. There were a gazillion more that we could have spoken to. I hope everyone listening will take a look at all the episodes that we were able to publish this year and give them a listen. I like to say that our podcasts are perfect for people with dogs because you can listen to an episode while you walk your dog. So happy dog walking, happy podcasting. We'll see you in the new year with Transform Now.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.